The gathering storm, the clouds rolled in thick and dark over Madison County, Florida that September afternoon. Nobody knew it yet, but Hurricane Helene would become one of the most destructive storms in recent memory. Weather reports had been warning people for days, but many locals had weathered hurricanes before and thought they were prepared. They weren't. Tae-ho Kim checked his emergency kit one last time before loading it into the rescue van. At 38, he had already saved hundreds of animals from disasters across the country. His weathered face showed lines of both worry and determination as he studied the radar images on his phone. This storm was different. It was slowing down, which meant it would dump massive amounts of rain on already saturated ground. "You ready?" asked his team leader, handing him a fresh radio. "As ready as I'll ever be," Tae-ho replied, securing the last of the animal crates. The Humane Society's animal rescue team had arrived just yesterday, ahead of the storm, setting up a makeshift command center in the local high school gym. Volunteers were already bringing in pets they couldn't evacuate with, and calls were flooding in about animals that might be left behind. Across town, the Park family was facing an impossible decision. Minho Park looked at his wife Eunji's tear-streaked face as she hugged their old golden retriever Momo. "The shelter says no pets on the evacuation buses," Minho said quietly, kneeling beside them both. "My brother won't answer his calls. I don't know what else to do." Their 10-year-old son Junseo buried his face in Momo's fur. "We can't leave him, Dad, please." The evacuation order had come suddenly. Their neighborhood, built in a low-lying area near the river, was directly in the flood zone. They had no car since the accident last winter, and the official evacuation center was 20 miles away. Eunji wiped her eyes. "Maybe we should stay?" Minho shook his head. "We can't risk it, not with Junseo." He looked at their son, then at Momo, whose gentle brown eyes seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. "We'll set him up in the backyard shed. It's on higher ground. I'll leave plenty of food and water, and we'll tie him where he can get to both the shed and open air." "But what if—" Eunji couldn't finish the sentence. "As soon as it's safe, we'll come back," Minho promised, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "The storm will pass quickly." The evacuation bus honked outside. Time had run out. Junseo suddenly ran to his room and returned with his favorite blue blanket. "Take this, Momo," he said, laying it in the shed. "It will keep you safe until we come back." Minho secured Momo in the backyard with a long lead that would allow him to move. Between the sturdy wooden shed and a covered porch area, he filled 3 large bowls with water and left enough food for several days. As a last thought, he tucked a note with their names and contact information into a plastic bag and attached it to Momo's collar. "Be brave, old friend," he whispered, giving the dog one final hug before rushing his family to the waiting bus. The first raindrops began to fall as the evacuation bus pulled away. Momo watched from the yard, barking once, twice before settling down on Junseo's blanket to wait for his family's return. At the Emergency Operations Center, Tae-ho studied the latest forecast with growing concern. The hurricane had slowed even further and shifted course slightly west, putting it on a direct path with Madison County. The rainfall predictions had doubled overnight. "We need more boats," he told his supervisor, pointing at the map. "These neighborhoods here and here are going to flood badly." His supervisor nodded grimly. "I'll see what I can do. In the meantime, finish preparing the intake center. We're going to have a lot of animals coming in." By nightfall, the wind was howling through the trees, bending them nearly double. Rain fell in sheets so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The power went out across the county, plunging neighborhoods into darkness. In their evacuation shelter, the Park family huddled together on cots, listening to the storm rage outside. Junseo clutched his father's hand. "Is Momo okay, Dad?" "Of course he is," Minho assured him, though his heart was heavy with doubt. "He's smart. He knows to go in the shed if it gets bad." But as the night wore on, the reports coming into the shelter grew worse. The river had already breached its banks. Several neighborhoods were underwater, and the rain showed no signs of stopping. Back in their neighborhood, water was rising inch by inch in the park's backyard. Momo had retreated to the shed as the wind and rain intensified, but now water was seeping under the door. The dog paced anxiously, pulling at his lead, sensing the danger but unable to escape. As midnight approached, the water reached his paws, then his ankles. His barks of distress were swallowed by the roaring wind, heard by no one as darkness enveloped the abandoned neighborhood. The storm was only beginning, and already Tae-ho and his team knew this would be one of the worst disasters they had ever faced. As he tried to sleep for a few hours before the morning rescue operations would begin, he couldn't shake the feeling that countless animals like Momo were out there, alone in the storm, waiting desperately for humans to save them. Morning broke. With no real dawn, just a slight lightening of the dark gray clouds that continued to release torrents of rain. The wind had died down somewhat, but the real damage was already done. Water stood 6 feet deep in the lowest parts of Madison County, and it was still rising as runoff from higher ground continued to flow downhill. Momo had spent a terrifying night. The water in the shed had risen to his belly by midnight, forcing him to stand without rest. By 3 a.m., the wooden structure had begun to shift on its foundation. A particularly strong gust of wind had torn the door partially from its hinges, allowing water to rush in even faster. The old golden retriever had no choice but to swim out into the yard. His lead had become tangled around the remains of a fallen tree branch. Though he could reach a small patch of ground that remained above water, a slight rise where Minho had planted a flower garden for Yoonji last spring, he couldn't get any farther. The water continued rising inch by inch, shrinking his small island of safety. Momo whimpered softly, his eyes scanning the familiar neighborhood that now looked like a vast lake. Cars were partially submerged in driveways. Front porches disappeared beneath the murky brown water. Debris floated past, lawn chairs, children's toys, roof shingles torn free by the wind. He barked once, twice, then settled into a pattern of distress calls. 3 sharp barks, then a pause, then 3 more. It was a sound that carried surprisingly well across the water, though there seemed to be no one left to hear it. At the emergency shelter, the Park family awakened to grim news. Their neighborhood was among the worst hit. Aerial photos shown on a volunteer's tablet revealed their street completely underwater, with only rooftops visible. Junseo burst into tears when he saw the images. "Momo, Dad, Momo's all alone out there." Minho put his arm around his son's shoulders, his own eyes filling with tears he tried to hide. "I know, buddy, but remember how smart he is. He'll find high ground." Yoonji joined them, her face pale with worry. "Is there anyone doing animal rescues?" she asked a passing volunteer. "The Humane Society team is gearing up now," the woman replied kindly. "They've been taking down addresses of people who had to leave pets behind." Minho immediately gave their information describing Momo and exactly where they had left him. The volunteer wrote everything down but couldn't promise when, or if, rescuers would be able to reach their street. "There are hundreds of calls coming in," she explained gently. "They're prioritizing areas they can actually get to first." At the high school gymnasium, Tae-ho and his team were facing the overwhelming reality of what lay ahead. Their planned rescue operations had been thrown into chaos by the sheer scale of the flooding. Roads that should have been accessible were now impassable. The boats they had brought were too few for the need. "Local fire department is lending us 2 more rescue boats," announced Ji-woo, Tae-ho's fellow rescuer. She was dripping wet from a brief trip outside, her dark hair plastered to her face. "And some volunteers with kayaks are offering to help with the smaller animals." Tae-ho nodded, studying the map where they were marking reported animal locations. A cluster of red pins indicated the neighborhood where the Park family lived. "We'll start in this zone," he decided. "Highest number of reports and the water's still rising there." As they loaded equipment into the boats, Hyun-ki, the youngest member of their team, looked troubled. "Do you think we'll be in time?" he asked, quietly. Tae-ho paused, rain pelting his face as he considered the question. "For some of them," he finally answered, "and that has to be enough to keep us going. We save the ones we can reach." By mid-morning, Momo's situation had become dire. The water had risen to cover all but a small patch of his island. He stood shivering, his old joints aching from hours of standing in one position. His fur was soaked through, providing little protection against the cooling temperature. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but thirst was worse. Surrounded by water, none of it was safe to drink. Still, the old dog maintained his pattern of barking, though it grew weaker as the hours passed. 3 barks, then rest. 3 more barks, then rest. It was all he could do. Around him, the neighborhood had fallen eerily quiet. Most wildlife had fled before the storm. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered. Even the wind had calmed, leaving only the sound of water gently lapping against submerged fences and mailboxes. In one heart-stopping moment, Momo saw another dog swimming desperately between houses across the street. It was Baxter, the young Labrador who lived with the elderly man at the corner. Their eyes met briefly before Baxter disappeared around the side of a house, carried by the current despite his efforts to swim against it. Momo barked frantically, trying to warn the younger dog of the danger, but Baxter didn't reappear. The silence that followed seemed even heavier than before. As noon approached, Momo's island had shrunk to a patch barely larger than his body. His barking had become a hoarse, weak sound. The water touched his paws now, a reminder that soon he would have to swim constantly to survive. At 12 years old with arthritis in his hips, he knew instinctively that he couldn't swim for long. Then, almost too faint to hear at first, came a sound that made his ears prick up, the low rumble of a motor, growing gradually louder. Momo summoned his remaining strength and barked again, 3 sharp sounds that echoed across the water. The motor sound changed direction, coming closer. Momo barked again, hope giving new strength to his voice. Around the corner of what had been his street appeared a small boat, with 3 figures hunched against the continuing rain. In the emergency shelter, Minho held his family close as they waited for news. Junseo had fallen into an exhausted sleep, his small face marked with dried tears. Yunji leaned against her husband's shoulder. "Do you think there's really a chance?" she whispered. Minho looked out at the rain still falling steadily outside the shelter windows. "I have to believe there is," he replied. "For Junseo's sake. And for Momo. Did you hear that?" Taiho tilted his head, straining to listen over the boat's motor and the constant patter of rain. Jiwoo nodded, pointing toward a row of partially submerged houses. "Barking. Coming from over there." Yun-Ki, the youngest rescuer, carefully turned the boat in the direction of the sound. They had been out for 4 hours already, navigating the flooded streets of Madison County. So far, they had rescued 7 dogs, 3 cats, and oddly enough, a pet rabbit that had somehow climbed atop a floating garbage can lid. Each successful rescue gave them renewed energy, but the challenges were mounting. "Watch for power lines," Taeho warned as they approached what had once been a quiet suburban street. Fallen electrical lines posed one of their biggest dangers, alongside hidden obstacles beneath the muddy water and the risk of the boat overturning. As they rounded the corner, they heard it again. 3 distinct barks, followed by silence, then 3 more. The sound was weaker than before, but definitely coming from a house midway down the block. "There," Jiwoo pointed suddenly, "on that little rise of ground. Is that a golden retriever?" Through the rain, they could just make out the form of a dog standing on a tiny patch of earth that barely kept him above the rising water. His golden fur was darkened and matted with moisture, his head hanging low with exhaustion. But as the boat's engine sound reached him, the dog raised his head and barked again, a clear call for help. "That's got to be the dog from the report we got at the shelter," Hyun-Ki said, checking his waterproof tablet. "Family named Park, dog named Momo." Taeho assessed the situation quickly. The water around the dog was relatively calm, but getting closer would be tricky. A partially submerged fence and some floating debris blocked a direct approach. "Cut the engine," he told Hyun-Ki. "We'll paddle in from here. Don't want to scare him, or create waves that might wash over his spot." As they drew closer using only paddles, they could see just how desperate Momo's situation had become. The patch of ground he stood on was barely larger than his body. The water touched his paws and his legs trembled visibly from hours of standing in one position. A frayed rope led from his collar to somewhere underwater. He was tethered and couldn't escape even if he had somewhere to go. Poor guy must have been standing like that all night, Jiwoo said softly. Look at his eyes. Momo's brown eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and desperate hope as the boat approached. He barked again, but the sound was raspy and weak. Easy now, easy. Taeho called in a soothing voice as they maneuvered closer. We're here to help you, Momo. Just stay calm. The dog watched them intently, his tail giving the faintest wag of recognition at his name. When they were about 10 feet away, their progress stopped. Can't get any closer without risking damage to the boat, Hyun-ki said, pointing at an almost completely submerged chain-link fence between them and the dog. Taeho nodded, already reaching for his waterproof bag. I'll go in. You two keep the boat steady. Water's cold, Jiwoo warned. And we don't know what's under there. No choice, Taeho replied simply, pulling on thick protective gloves. He won't last much longer. Carefully, Taeho lowered himself over the side of the boat. The water came up to his chest immediately, its chill seeping through his waterproof clothing. Using a small handheld sonar device, he checked for dangerous obstacles in his path. Clear so far, he called back to his teammates. I'm going to try to reach him. Step by careful step, Taeho made his way toward Momo. The bottom was uneven, sometimes dropping unexpectedly or rising just as suddenly. Twice he stumbled on unseen debris. All around him floated the remnants of people's lives, a child's backpack, kitchen utensils, a sodden photo album splayed open to reveal water-damaged family pictures. As he got closer, Momo became increasingly agitated, whining and shifting his paws nervously on his tiny island. It's okay, boy, Taeho called softly. I'm here to help. Stay calm for me. Just 5 feet away now, he could see the rope more clearly. It led from Momo's collar down into the water, where it appeared to be tangled around something heavy. The dog couldn't have freed himself if he tried. You've been so brave. Taeho continued talking, moving slowly to avoid startling the frightened animal. Your family is waiting for you. They sent us to find you. At the mention of family, Momo's ears perked up. His tail wagged slightly again, a small sign of hope in his exhausted body. When Taeho finally reached the dog, he stood for a moment, letting Momo sniff his gloved hand. That's right, I'm a friend. Now let's get this off you. The rope was tightly tangled around a fallen tree branch that had wedged itself against the fence. Taeho worked quickly with waterproof cutting tools, aware that Momo's island was shrinking by the minute as water continued to rise. Almost there, he murmured, cutting through the last stubborn strands. Just a little more. The rope finally gave way. Momo seemed to understand he was free, but made no move to jump into the water. His legs were too stiff, his strength too depleted. I know, buddy, I'll carry you, Taeho said, carefully sliding his arms under the dog's body. Momo was heavy, at least 70 pounds of waterlogged golden retriever, but adrenaline gave Taeho the strength he needed. Cradling the dog against his chest, he began the careful journey back to the boat. Each step was more difficult than the last. The cold water sapped his energy, and Momo's weight made balancing treacherous. From the boat, Jiwoo and Hyun-ki watched anxiously. He's struggling, Jiwoo said. The current's picking up. Indeed, the water was flowing faster now, pushing against Taeho as he fought his way back. About halfway to the boat, his foot slipped on something beneath the surface. He staggered, nearly going under, managing to keep Momo's head above water even as he floundered. I'm coming in, Hyun-ki called, already securing a rope around his waist. No, Taeho shouted back, regaining his footing. Stay with the boat. I can make it. Gritting his teeth against the cold and exhaustion, he pressed forward. Momo lay still, in his arms, too weak even to struggle. The dog's trust was complete, his life entirely in Taeho's hands. After what seemed like hours but was really only minutes, Taeho reached the boat. Jiwoo leaned over to take Momo, lifting the dog with surprising strength into the safety of the vessel. Then she and Hyun-ki helped Tae-ho climb aboard, his limbs stiff and clumsy from the cold. Once inside, they immediately wrapped Momo in emergency thermal blankets. The dog was shivering violently, his breathing rapid and shallow. "He needs veterinary care right away," Jiwoo said, checking his gums and eyes. "Hypothermia, possible shock, dehydration for sure." Tae-ho nodded, still catching his breath. "Let's get him back to the shelter. Radio ahead so they're ready for us." As Hyun-ki turned the boat and carefully navigated back toward their base, Tae-ho sat beside Momo, one hand resting gently on the dog's damp head. "You're going to see your family again," he promised quietly. "Just hang on a little longer." Momo's eyes, though tired, fixed on Tae-ho's face. And for the first time since they'd found him, his tail thumped weakly against the floor of the boat, a small gesture of gratitude that meant more to Tae-ho than any words could have. Back at the emergency shelter, the Park family had no idea that their beloved pet had just been pulled from the rising waters. They could only wait, hope, and pray that somehow, somewhere, humans would save the four-legged member of their family before it was too late. The makeshift animal shelter at Madison County High School's auxiliary gymnasium buzzed with activity. Rows of crates and temporary pens lined the walls, each housing an animal rescued from the flood. Volunteers moved purposefully between stations, feeding, cleaning, and offering comfort to the scared and often injured animals. The air smelled of wet fur, antiseptic, and the lingering aroma of the donated pizza that had fed the volunteer crew at lunch. In a quieter corner, partially screened off with portable dividers, Sunmi Lee hunched over a treatment table where Momo lay wrapped in warm blankets. As the lead veterinarian for the emergency response team, she had been working almost non-stop since the hurricane hit, treating everything from minor scrapes to life-threatening injuries. "How's our golden boy doing?" Do-yeon asked, approaching with fresh towels. The young volunteer had taken a special interest in Momo since he'd been brought in 3 hours earlier. Sunmi's face showed the fatigue of someone who hadn't properly slept in days, but her movements remained precise as she checked Momo's temperature. "Better. His core temperature is almost normal now, but I'm worried about his lungs." The golden retriever's breathing came in shallow, ragged gasps, occasionally interrupted by a wet-sounding cough. His eyes, though, followed the humans around, him with clear awareness, and when Sunmi stroked his head, his tail gave a feeble thump against the table. "He inhaled some contaminated water," Sunmi explained, preparing an injection of antibiotics. "We need to get ahead of any potential pneumonia. And he's dehydrated, though the IV fluids are helping with that." Do-yeon nodded, gently patting Momo's damp fur with the towels. "His family must be so worried. Have we found them yet?" "The admin team is cross-checking his collar tag information with evacuation records," Sunmi replied. "The good news is he has clear identification and a note from his owners, so we know who we're looking for." Across town at the main evacuation center, Minho Park paced near the entrance, checking his phone every few minutes despite knowing there was still no cell service in most of the county. His son Jun Seo sat quietly on a cot, clutching his father's jacket and staring blankly at the wall. The boy had barely spoken since seeing the aerial photos of their flooded neighborhood that morning. Yoon-ji returned from the information desk, her face tight with worry. "They still don't have any updates from the animal rescue teams. Too many areas are cut off and communications are spotty." Minho ran his hand through his hair in frustration. "It's been almost a full day since the worst of the storm. Surely they've reached our street by now." "They're doing their best," Yoon-ji said softly, though her eyes revealed her own fear. "There are thousands of people and animals affected. We just have to wait. Waiting is the hardest part," Minho murmured, sitting down beside Junseo and putting an arm around his son's shoulders. "But we don't give up hope, right?" Junseo looked up at his father with red-rimmed eyes. "Momo is smart," he said in a small voice, "and brave. If anyone could survive, it's him." Minho swallowed hard against the lump in his throat. "That's right, buddy. Momo is the bravest dog I know." An hour later, a volunteer with a clipboard approached the family. "Park? Family of Minho Park?" They jumped to their feet instantly. "That's us," Minho said, his heart pounding. Good news or bad? The volunteer's face gave nothing away. We just got word from the animal emergency shelter at the high school, the volunteer said, checking her notes. They have a golden retriever named Momo there. He was rescued this morning from your address. Junseo let out a cry that was half sob, half laughter. Momo's alive? He's really alive? The volunteer smiled. Yes, he's alive. He's receiving medical care, but the initial report says he's stable. Yoonji covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face. Minho had to sit down as relief made his knees weak. When can we see him? Junseo asked, suddenly animated for the first time in days. That's the difficult part, the volunteer explained gently. The roads between here and the high school are still impassable. They're working on clearing a route, but it might be a few days before civilian travel is possible. The family's faces fell at this news, but the volunteer quickly added, but they can set up a video call for you later today, once they have the satellite connection working, and they'll send daily updates until you can be reunited. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. After days of uncertainty and fear, just knowing Momo was alive and in good hands felt like a miracle. That evening, huddled around a tablet borrowed from the shelter staff, the Park family had their first glimpse of Momo. The video was grainy and the connection kept freezing, but they could clearly see their beloved dog resting in a clean kennel, looking tired but alert. Momo, it's us, boy, Junseo called excitedly. On screen, Momo's ears perked up at the sound of the familiar voice, and his tail began to wag. Duyan, who was holding the camera at the animal shelter, laughed. He definitely recognizes your voices. He's been much more responsive since we started the call. How is he doing, really? Yoonji asked, searching the volunteer's face for any sign she might be sugarcoating the situation. He's improving every hour, Doyan assured them. Dr. Lee started him on antibiotics for a respiratory infection, and he's responding well. He's eating small amounts now, and his temperature is normal. The main concern was hypothermia and exhaustion when he first came in, but he's a fighter. Minho nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging his throat. On screen, Momo whined softly, trying to get closer to the sound of his family's voices. He must have been so scared, Junseo said, his voice breaking. All alone in the flood. He wasn't alone for long, Doyan said gently. Our rescue team found him just in time. The rescuer who went in after him, Taeho, has been checking on him constantly. Would you like to meet him? He's here now. The camera view shifted, and suddenly a man with kind eyes and a tired smile appeared beside Momo's kennel. Hello, Park family, I'm very glad to meet you, though I wish it were under better circumstances. Minho bowed his head slightly in respect. We can never thank you enough for saving our Momo. He's been part of our family since Junseo was a baby. Taeho nodded, reaching through the kennel bars to stroke Momo's head. The dog leaned into his touch. He's a special one, very brave. He kept barking to lead us to him, even though he was so exhausted. That sounds like our Momo, Yoonji said, smiling through her tears. Always letting us know what he needs. For the next 10 minutes, they talked with Taeho and Doyan, getting every detail of Momo's rescue and treatment. Junseo asked dozens of questions, his natural curiosity returning with the relief of knowing Momo was safe. Before ending the call, Doyan promised to set up another video chat the next day. And I'll send photos and updates throughout the day too, she added, so you know exactly how he's doing. As the screen went dark, the Park family sat in a circle, holding hands. For the first time since the evacuation, there was a sense of hope. 2 weeks, Minho said firmly. The emergency coordinator says it might be 2 weeks before we can get back to see Momo and check on our house. Junseo's face fell for a moment, but then he squared his small shoulders. Then we'll be brave for 2 weeks, he declared, like Momo was brave during the storm. Yoonji smiled, pulling her son close. Yes, we'll be brave together. And when we see Momo again, it will be the happiest day. That night, in separate locations, miles apart, both the Park family and their beloved dog slept peacefully for the first time since the hurricane hit, connected by love that even floodwaters couldn't wash away, and by the compassion of strangers who had become their lifeline. In the darkest hours, 2 weeks after Hurricane Helene, the waters finally began to recede from Madison County. Roads emerged from beneath the murky flood, revealing cracked pavement and deep potholes where the current had eaten away at the foundations. Buildings stood mud-stained and battered but mostly intact, a testament to modern building codes and a bit of luck. At the animal emergency shelter in the high school gym, the atmosphere had changed from frantic emergency response to something more organized and hopeful. Many animals had been reunited with their families, empty cages now stacked neatly against one wall. Volunteers still moved busily about, but their faces showed less strain and laughter occasionally echoed through the space. In his special corner, Momo lounged on a donated dog bed, looking remarkably recovered. His golden coat had been washed and brushed until it gleamed again. Though still thinner than he had been before the hurricane, his eyes were bright and alert, his breathing clear of the worrying rasp that had concerned Dr. Sunmi in those first critical days. Du-Yan approached with a bright blue leash in hand. "Today's the big day, handsome," she said, bending down to ruffle Momo's ears. "Your family is finally coming home." At the word family, Momo's tail immediately began to thump against his bed. After 2 weeks of daily video calls, the old dog clearly understood that he would soon see his people in person. Taiho walked over, carrying a small bag of medications and special food that Sunmi had prepared for Momo's continued recovery. "Everything ready for the reunion?" he asked, his usually serious face softened by a smile. "All set," Do-Yan confirmed. "The parks are being driven over from the main evacuation center now. Should be here in about 20 minutes. Taiho nodded, looking down at Momo with a complex mix of emotions. Like many rescue workers, he tried not to get too attached to the animals he saved. There were always more waiting to be rescued, more work to be done. But something about this old golden retriever had broken through his professional distance. "You did good, buddy," he said softly, crouching down to be at eye level with the dog. "Your family never gave up on you, and you never gave up either." Momo gazed back at him, brown eyes somehow conveying understanding beyond what most humans would credit to a dog. He leaned forward and gently licked Taiho's hand once, a simple gesture of canine gratitude that meant more to the rescuer than any human thanks. Outside, a convoy of trucks and vans pulled into the school parking lot. These were the first civilian vehicles allowed back into the recently reopened neighborhoods. Families would have just a few hours to check their homes and retrieve essential belongings before returning to temporary housing. The infrastructure of water and electricity was still weeks away from being restored in the worst-hit areas. Among the arriving vehicles was a white van with emergency management stenciled on its side. It parked near the gym entrance, and the driver opened the sliding door to reveal the Park family inside. Junseo jumped out first, practically vibrating with excitement despite the solemnity of the occasion. Minho helped Yunji down, then grabbed a few bags from inside the van. All three wore identical bright yellow wristbands, markers that allowed them temporary access to their restricted neighborhood. "Remember," the driver called after them, "back here by 3 o'clock. We need to be out of the zone before dark." Minho nodded his understanding before turning to his family. "Ready?" Junseo was already halfway to the door. "Come on, Momo's waiting." Inside the gym, Do-Yan had clipped the leash to Momo's collar and was gently guiding him toward the entrance. The dog moved stiffly, arthritis aggravated by his ordeal, but with determination, nose already working overtime as he picked up familiar scents in the air. The double doors swung open, and Junseo burst through them. He stopped suddenly, frozen in place as he spotted Momo. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Boy and dog locked in a moment of disbelieving joy. "Momo!" Junseo finally cried, breaking the spell. The old dog let out a sound that was part bark, part howl of happiness. He lunged forward with surprising strength, nearly pulling the leash from Do-Yan's hand in his eagerness to reach his boy. They met in the middle of the gym floor, Junseo dropping to his knees and throwing his arms around Momo's neck, the dog whining and wiggling and trying to lick every inch of the boy's face at once. Minho and Yunji weren't far behind, both dropping to the floor to join the emotional reunion. Volunteers and staff gathered at a respectful distance, witnessing the moment with misty eyes and knowing smiles. These scenes had played out dozens of times in the past week, yet they never grew less moving. Worth every minute in that cold water, Taeho murmured to no one in particular. After the initial burst of emotion, Minho stood and approached Taeho and Doyeon. He bowed deeply. "Thank you for saving our family," he said simply. "Because that's what you did. Momo is family." "We were just doing our jobs," Taeho replied, though his voice betrayed deeper emotion. "No," Minho said firmly. "You did much. More than a job. You risked your life going into that water. We watched the video Doyeon sent us. We saw how dangerous it was." Yoonji joined them, her eyes still wet with tears of joy. "We'll never forget what you've done, never." After the Parks had spent some time with Momo and received instructions for his continued care, it was time for them to visit their home. Taeho offered to drive them in one of the rescue team's trucks, a vehicle better equipped to handle the damaged roads than the evacuation vans. The neighborhood, when they reached it, was a sobering sight. The floodwaters had receded enough to reveal mud-caked streets and yards strewn with debris. Some houses showed water lines reaching halfway up their first floors. Others had lost portions of their roofs to the hurricane winds. The Park house stood with its door hanging open, forced by the floodwaters or rescue teams, it wasn't clear. Inside, everything below waist height was ruined, coated in drying mud and beginning to grow mold in the humid Florida air. Minho surveyed the damage in silence, his arm around Yoonji's shoulders. Junseo stayed outside with Momo, both sitting in the truck bed where Taeho had made them comfortable with blankets. "It will take months," Minho finally said, looking at the home they had worked so hard to create. "Maybe longer." Yoonji nodded, leaning into her husband's side. "But we're all safe. That's what matters most." As they gathered the few salvageable items they could find, photo albums from high shelves, documents from a watertight box, a few precious family mementos, Minho made a decision. "When we rebuild," he told Taeho as they loaded the truck, "we're going to include an emergency pet shelter, something high enough to stay above any flood, with access to the second floor." Taeho looked surprised. "For Momo?" "For Momo, yes. But also for other animals." Minho's expression grew determined. No one should have to leave their pets behind again. If more homes had safe spaces for animals during disasters, fewer rescues would be needed. Over the following months, as Madison County slowly rebuilt, Minho's idea spread. The local government, prompted by citizen demand, incorporated pet-friendly requirements into their disaster response plans. The high school built a permanent structure that could serve as an animal shelter during emergencies. Training programs sprang up, teaching pet owners how to prepare emergency kits and evacuation plans for their animals. 1 year later, when Hurricane Marco threatened the Florida coast, Madison County was ready. Evacuation buses accepted pets alongside their owners. Emergency shelters had designated animal areas, and in the Park family's rebuilt home, a special room on the second floor stood stocked with pet supplies, accessible via a custom ramp that would allow Momo, now moving slower but still happy, to reach safety on his own if needed. On the anniversary of Momo's rescue, Taeho visited the Parks in their new home. As they sat in the backyard watching Junseo play fetch with Momo, Taeho smiled at the transformation, not just of the house and neighborhood, but of the community's approach to disaster preparedness. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "in rescue work, we often say we're saving animals, but the truth is they save us too. They remind us what's important, what's worth fighting for." Minho nodded, watching his son laugh as Momo brought back a well-loved tennis ball. "That's something we learned from all this. Sometimes humans save animals, and sometimes in their own way animals save humans too."